doing that right now. All right, and I am also going to mute people so that background noises don't interfere with our speaker. But we will have question and answer period at the end. And what I'm going to suggest to people is if you think of questions that you'd like to ask, write them in the chat to all section of the Zoom, and we will read through those questions at the end, and hopefully Peggy has some answers to them along the way, or somebody does. And we're gonna go from there. So let me just go down my list here and see what I can. Okay, some of you have muted yourselves. And let me make sure I've got everybody down the list dealt with here. I think so. Okay, and we'll go from there. Welcome, everybody. In case you don't know who I am Robin Rienstra. I am the current president of the Board of Trustees for the Meadowlands Museum, and we are thrilled to be doing this speaker series on Zoom as a way of sharing history with the public, even in these odd days of none of us going anywhere and participating in things that are inside. We will be doing other Zoom series talks in the upcoming months as well. Our website will always be the place to register for those as well. And before tonight is over, we will let you know what the next event is going to be that we do now have booked in as well. I'd like to just indicate is that while we've been able to do these events for free, the museum is obviously a small, struggling nonprofit organization. And if anybody cares to help and contribute to the museum, there are several ways to do that, some of which don't even cost any money to the participant who's involved with sharing. And I'd just like to quickly run through them so people are familiar with the options that exist. We have memberships at varying rates for individuals and families and seniors. And with a membership, you'll get notification of events that are like this that are coming up and other things that we do. It comes with some discounts when we have some paid activities as well. We have 3 different banks in the area that if people have bank accounts with those banks and care to link their account at the bank branch with our nonprofit through the special programs that these banks run. The banks of Blue Foundry Bank, Investor Savings.
Red light and says REC. Is it recording?
Yes. And that means somebody isn't muted. That's Oksana. Okay. Yes, we are recording the activity. So we have BCB Bank, Investor Savings, and Blue Foundry Bank that have special programs where they will provide to nonprofit organizations a percentage of the profits that they make off of your account at no cost to you. They will contribute quarterly to nonprofits such as the museum. And we are involved with all 3 of those different banks' programs. We accept donations at any time. We have a GoFundMe site, which is dedicated towards improvements on the building. We are in the midst of some renovations to some of the woodworking and painting of our building, and still looking for funding to help with that. We have a new program in place where for people who live in Rutherford, we are selling framed photos of practically every house that exists in the town. These are photos that were taken, we believe, in the mid-1950s, and we are producing framed 11 by 14 beautiful matted photographs under glass of those houses for people. We have plant sales 3 times a year. We have one coming up the week before Mother's Day, one in the fall, and one for poinsettias before Christmas holidays, late November time period. And those have been very popular and with people in the area as well. We put on a Scarecrow Day in the fall and in mid-October, and invite people to come to the front lawn of the museum and build a scarecrow. We provide the stand for it and the clothing, and people rent the stand, and we have a specialized extra activity attached to it that for the next few weeks, we post all of these pictures on our website, and people can actually vote for their favorite, and we give out a People's Choice Award to the one that gets the most votes on this as well. And so those are some of the different ways that people can financially help us, as well as be involved with some of our activities along the way. We are also always looking for people who might be interested in volunteering with the museum. There's all kinds of things that always need to be done, and there's actually a list of some of those things on our website as well. So if anybody's looking for an extra project, please feel free to check it out. That said, I am about to turn this over to our speaker for the night, Peggy Norris. And Peggy is the chair of the Bergen County Quilt and Coverlet Show. She's a member of several local historical societies and a member of the American Quilt Study Group and Brownstone Quilters. And she is involved with a project to identify, and what she's going to talk about tonight is all of these amazing collection of quilts that have been found through Bergen County, and the cataloging of them, the eventual exhibiting of them. But we are really looking forward to hearing what you have to say, Peggy, on this. So with that, I'm going to mute myself and turn this over to you to enlighten us about the historic world of quilts.
Thank you, Robin. Thank you so much for asking me to come tonight. It's when I looked at your website a little while ago, I noticed that you had a program in the fall with the same title about historic costumes. So this one's going to be about quilts.
Yeah, that title was actually the title of an exhibit
okay.
at the museum, and in a previous year as well. So,
well, it's hard to come up with a comprehensive title, so I guess we're just running in the same track there. The Bergen County Quilt and Coverlet Show itself is not currently scheduled, but we are going to come out with our exhibit catalog, and we will have the show when it's a time when we can schedule a time when we can all go and celebrate and not feel fearful about going out. The team went to over 15 museums in Bergen County. Did you know we had so many? And uncovered the quilts that you're going to see in my program tonight, and many others. Is amazing wealth in our small museums. We don't have any one big museum, but we have many wonderful small museums, including the Meadowlands Museum. And I want to thank Tom Biven and Dora Rodriguez for welcoming us to the museum. In October, the scarecrows were out on the lawn, so and it was you know, COVID was heating up again, and we were really anxious to get through, and we were so excited that we were able to get to the Meadowlands. And you'll see a couple of those quilts tonight. You have an amazing quilt collection, and support your museum with your membership and all of those other things that Robin mentioned. I'm going to turn off my camera so you can just see the slides. And if you have questions, please write them in the chat, and I will be glad to answer them when we're all finished. And with that, I gotta find the right bars here. Video. So if that bar with everybody's face on it's in your way, you can click the little minus sign, it'll get little. So I do have a committee that has been working, and you can see their names there. The photography was done by Marion Brown, except for the quilts from the Meadowlands, and Tom Biven took those photographs. So this is an image of the front cover of the catalog that's coming out. It's at the publisher. On the left is an image at the lower left of looking in people's closets. That's a picture from the Meadowlands of the racks and the closets, storage closets. So that's what we went through, was everybody's boxes. And here we are at the top in the Schoolhouse Museum in Ridgewood, hanging that coverlet for photographing, and that's where we took most of the photographs. So I was thinking about, how do we talk to people about quilts who maybe haven't thought about quilts and don't really know much about them. I thought, well, let's look at why we use quilts. Obviously, one of the reasons is warmth. We use quilts to commemorate events, as gifts of love, gifts of comfort, fundraising. You mentioned that. You had used it for raffling, for fundraising. We use quilts to honor, and all those are kinds of service. We make quilts for show, for showing off, and we make quilts are made and displayed as a form of status. We make quilts for remembrance and friendship and storytelling. So we're on to see all these quilts again, and we'll talk about those things. So what is a quilt? It has a backing, fabric. It has a batting or middle layer for warmth, and it has a top layer. And the top layer can be plain or decorated in different ways. And there are things we call quilts that don't meet this definition, but by and large, when you say quilt, this is what you mean. So if we go back in time to our colonial days, there were only natural fibers: flax, wool, silk, and cotton. And each of them had many steps in order to be processed to be made into fabric. And those steps were difficult. Preparing flax involves a lot of steps to strip the flax, things that are woven into the flax from the stalks. Things have to be washed several times. When you prepare, after you've prepared your material, it has to be spun, and then it has to be woven. And all those were labors that had to be done by hand, which made textiles very expensive. And they were well used. This is a picture of the Campbell Christie House at the historic Newbridge Landing. And these Dutch houses might have had built-in beds like this. Would not have been as fancy as this, probably. And so completely enclosed, but the bed coverings would have been woven. This is an example of a coverlet from the collection of the Oakland Historical Society. It could be woven on a loom like the one you saw on the previous slide. So the beds would have looked like this. These are all woven fabrics. Very simple, nice to our eye, but these are blankets and sheets, not quilts. So one of the early ways of decorating a bed for wealthy people was to make bed hangings, and in this case, a valance. This valance is at the Hermitage, and these three pieces would go on the bed here, alongside the short side and then another long side to decorate the top. And this is a close-up here. This is linen or cotton that has been embroidered with cotton yarn and to make the design. And these are some other examples. At the turn of the 19th century, in other words, around 1800, white was the color that of choice for many things, the bedroom, for dresses. And so in order to provide some kind of decoration, you did embroidery, which this is another center of another embroidered piece. Or and this is a quilted piece that is stuffed. So each of the little areas that you see in dark being held up to the light here are stuffed. And this is in pretty poor condition. This is a reproduction of a piece of that to see how it's done, and that you can see that it matches the pattern here, and it's very time consuming. So at the end of the 18th century, the Industrial Revolution is well underway, and it really is an industrial revolution of the making of fabric. We got the spinning jenny to work with making thread. We get the cotton gin to clean the cotton, so the cotton becomes a more important fiber than it had been. We have mechanical weaving, and we get cylinder printing. So all of the processes that go into making fabric are being mechanized. And that that technology develops and spreads and fits and starts. So you may have it being very active in Birmingham, England, and not so active on the frontier in America. But now these are the kinds of fabrics that can be produced. A far cry from our plain checks and plaids. And these fabrics inspired a lot of quilts. And so our beds can be decorated in a more fancy fashion. This is a quilt. It's not really a quilt, it's a spread. There's no batting. That belongs to the Ridgewood Historical Society. It was made in the Netherlands, in Gorkum, around 1800, the same time as those, time period as those white quilts, but looks very different. It did not come to this country with the early Dutch settlers. It came here in the 20th century with an immigrant from Holland. There's what the little town would look like. And there's close-ups of some of these fabrics that are being produced with the tools of the Industrial Revolution. This fabric has been reproduced by for quilters. Looks exactly like that. So people are going back to these fabrics, looking at them and producing new ones. All right, remember I said that the top piece of the quilt could be decorated? Well, one of the ways of decorating it is to sew pieces of fabric together to make a pattern. This sample piece is very simple. You can see the seams go right up here, and those pieces are pieced together. So this is one of our early Bergen County pieced quilts. This was in the Dater family. It would have been very expensive at the time to have purchased all of this yardage to use in the back. That's called a pheasant and palm chintz. And actually the same fabric is used throughout these also. So significant amount of fabric. Not the same as this, but the same pink fabric is used in each of these sunflowers. There you see a close-up of the sunflower photos. And so each of these lines is a piece line. Each of those is sewn together by hand. And then this is the chintz that it's set into. This is Catherine Hopper Van Buskirk. She is listed by the donor as the owner of this quilt, which is again made from two separate fabrics, so required a lot of fabric. And I'm going to show you some pictures and mention people's names. I don't expect you to remember them, but some of the women who made these quilts, it's the only thing that survives that tells us about her, because so much of what women did is only reflected in men's records. So that's one reason that quilts are of interest to historians. This is a close-up of those fabrics and more true to the color than that overall picture. This is a quilt that knocked our socks off when we saw it. It's from the Meadowlands Museum. And I was like, that's not a New Jersey quilt. Well, after a little investigation and talking with some people who know more about quilts than I do, and of course, not every quilt in our Bergen County museums is a New Jersey quilt. It is just, the colors on this are so bright. And, you know, we just hadn't seen anything like it. It was donated by the Hood family of Rutherford. And it was what we finally figured out. It was likely made by Barbara Hood's German-American ancestors who lived in the Long Valley area, Warren, Sussex, and Morris counties. They sort of moved around. And probably was made in the 1840s. So it's many generations back. But those, when you think about them being ethnically German, these colors make more sense. They're the same colors that are used in the southeast Pennsylvania by the German American settlers, the Dutch, Pennsylvania Dutch. This is also pieced in each of these little diamonds, a similar kind of fabric. And you'll notice that there's a plan to this. There's 3 colors of red fabric in a white row, 3 colors of blue fabric in a white row, 3 colors of yellow fabric, and so on. So it's planned out like that, and it looks as bright in person as it does on that screen. And it's also quite large. There you get a close-up of some of the fabrics. This is another older quilt. This was not made in New Jersey, but up near Warwick, New York. This family was from Sugarloaf. And there are no straight seam lines in this quilt. It's all hand pieced, and it's all in circles. You could make this by, making a square down, separating all these pieces, but this is not done that way. It's all curved seams making this. And this one, it was inscribed from Mary Wood to her son, and we were able, by knowing where it ended up, figure out who Mary Wood was, and she was from Sugarloaf. I'll keep going backwards. I don't need to go backwards. This is another older quilt before 1850. This is in the collection of the Friends of the Hermitage. There was no information with the quilt to tell us where it was from, but when we hung it up to take the photograph, there embroidered in one of those center blocks was the quilt maker's name. This is called Caesar's Crown, this pattern. And again, this is all made with 3 fabrics: the background, this chintz, and a pink print. So the brown fabric is splitting in all of these places. You don't notice it too much from a distance, but early brown dyes were very corrosive, and they just eat away at the fabric, and it's a conservation problem with some of these quilts, but it doesn't affect the beauty of this quilt. And there's her name, Maria Bernoy, and it's in little teeny tiny cross stitches. This is a quilt that's called a log cabin quilt. This from the Ridgewood Historical Society. And we had not seen any other log cabins like this. It's very common for this time period, but we just hadn't seen any. And it turns out that the family that owned it, although a longtime Bergen family, the Bantas, in the previous 2 generations, so the generations when the quilt could have been made, there were people from other places who married into the Bantas. So this may be a New Jersey quilt, or it may be a Pennsylvania quilt, or it might be a Wisconsin quilt, or by the time you've gone that far, you have no idea where it's from. But it's a very interesting pattern, and the use of stripes on this really makes it, it makes your eye go round, keep looking for things. This is the block. You make the block this way out of strips of fabric, and it's most often made with one side dark and one side light, and then the way they are arranged makes the pattern. So these are all different patterns that can be made with that one block. And you see this is the barn raising pattern here. And that's where that block would be, the dark half and the light half. We're going to see some more later, very different looking, also made with the same log cabin block. Another way of decorating that top surface is applique. And in that case, you take a piece of fabric and in some way make a shape and attach it to the top. So you're not piecing together 2 pieces and making a seam. You are sewing down a piece of fabric or applying it on top of another piece. This is one of the first quilts we saw. It's from the Mahwah Museum, and we couldn't believe it. You know, where is this? What does it come from? And it, after a great deal of research, turns out that it's probably from North Carolina. It may have belonged to an early governor of North Carolina, James Turner, And we're talking 1800 to 1820 that it would have been made. It may not have been made in a home, but may have been made professionally in some kind of workshop. The workmanship on this is exquisite. And the way it's done is that a piece of fabric, printed fabric, is cut apart and the individual pieces are then spread out and appliqued down onto a ground fabric. So you could take a piece of fabric that maybe was this big, cut out all the pieces and put them around here, and then you have a bed-size covering for a small investment in your printed, very expensive printed fabric. So this is the ground fabric. This is the printed fabrics that's been cut out. In many cases, the outline of the cutout would be rather rough. In this case, the outline is precisely along the die line, and the piece is held down with very teeny tiny buttonhole stitches. And we have moths and butterflies around too. Here you can see on this bird, again with the brown, we have this loss in the brown areas. But this little buttonhole stitch that holds down the edges and also decorates the breast of the bird. This is the quilt that was behind me. It's also appliqued. This little thing may be pieced, but then it's appliqued down and all the stems and leaves are appliqued. It was very popular in the middle 19th century, say 1850 to 1880, to make red and green quilts. Those were two colors that were relatively fast and so that they wouldn't fade in the washing and in the light. It's a close-up. You can see, if you look closely here, that where all those white dots are, that the fabric is missing. And that's because a dark brown or black dye was used on here to make a figure, and that has literally rotted away the whole piece of fabric. And here, that figure is orangish and has not damaged the fabric. Applique can be very fancy, and we have a few very fancy quilts, applique quilts. This one was made by friends of Margaret Jane Zabriskie, who married Martin Hogan Camp. It was the blocks were apparently made for her wedding. Her sister Eliza made about half the blocks, and each block has a woman's name on it. So 8 of her other friends contributed blocks to make this quilt. The quilt was never made up, but the blocks continued to be passed down in the family. And in the 1980s, the quilt was assembled and quilted by quilters in the Amish country. It's an outstanding example of an applique quilt. This was Civil War time, so patriotism, eagles, anything expression of support for the Union was important. This is a block from another applique quilt that the Zabriskie House owns, and it's interesting because of all the little things, but particularly the little girls with their dresses on. This is the dress, this is the kind of dress that little girls were wearing. And you can see the neckline is the same, having trim around the collar, little ribbon at the waist, and the flared skirt. So I find it interesting that with just a few stitches and a way you cut the fabric, it can actually reflect the style of the clothing. And this is applique turned to its most minimal, which is one color and bold shapes. This is a full-size bed quilt, so those shapes are big. They're all done in the same red fabric. There are no names on this one and no idea where, when, why this one was made. This block is pieced, but all of the other blocks are applique. And I was watching a program, and we quilters do, you know, we talk to each other and go on Zoom and learn things. And somebody was talking about a quilt that had a castor bean leaf on it. And she was talking about it. And I said, well, I know, that must be what that is on that quilt. You can see down here, I knew what that was there, but I hadn't really thought about what kind of leaf it was. This is a castor bean, and it was a popular plant. And this quilt's probably made in the 1890s, that kind of time period. And this on one of the quilts, and several of them have cactus-like things. And I wonder if this was meant to be a Christmas cactus. So then we have embroidered quilts. We talked about embroidery on that very early, the bed valances. Smaller type embroidery is used on other quilts. And embroidery is just done onto the surface of a fabric with thread and a needle. And you can make different stitches, you can follow the outlines. So this is a fundraising quilt that was made by the Pastors' Help Society in 1898 of the Presbyterian Church in Ridgewood, which is now First Presbyterian Church. And you paid something to have your name on the quilt, and somebody wrote the names and embroidered them. And then probably the quilt was also then either auctioned or raffled off to raise more money. So it just kept raising money. And it was eventually donated to the Schoolhouse Museum. But this is all, the shapes are embroidered, the names are embroidered. It's all done with red embroidery floss. And this kind of embroidery is usually done with red or blue. This is another kind of embroidered quilt. We're coming into the 20th century now. This was made in the 1950s. And the design here, which would 100 years before that have been made with applique, are made with cross stitch. And that wasn't supposed to happen. I guess we see more of that later. This was a kit too, and we'll talk about that later. I thought that was going to come up here. So another design feature on the quilt is the quilting itself. And we all have a picture of the early Americans sitting around a quilting frame like this, and young girls quilting. And what they're doing is putting stitches in all three of those layers to hold it together and to make a design. So quilting could be done in a group, which is how we often think of it. It could also be done within the family by one or two people. Here's a romantic view of what a quilting bee might have looked like. It was often an excuse for young women to get together and then to have a party in the evening and invite the young men. And here's a genre painting from 1813. So this is not romantic in the sense of looking back and making up the details. these are the details as the painter created them. So here is the young woman cutting the quilt off the frame. So presumably it's finished. She's not actually cutting the quilt. She's cutting the ties that hold the quilt. And the young men have arrived and they're going to have the dinner after the quilting. This is another quilt, this property of the Meadowlands Museum. It was donated by one of your local families whose name I can't remember. I should have looked it up before I did the program. It came from Western Pennsylvania, either Washington County, Pennsylvania, or across the border into Ohio. And it's a pieced pattern. That's the block. And it's exquisitely quilted. The quilting is very dense and forms figures here. This is called a feathered wreath. It's got a cross hatching inside, and then we have lines in the background. And it's just a beautiful quilt. You don't see a lot of quilts made in New Jersey that are quilted this densely. It's more Pennsylvania and Ohio. But it was really nice to find it at the Meadowlands. And this is the quilting on that Caesar's Crown quilt that I showed you before. This is looking from the back, and you can see that the pieces are outlined and then there's filling in. So we have hearts, or lots of hearts in that quilt. It's possible that it was a wedding quilt. There also were in the these areas in the border, little figures, different figures quilted in. So if you look closely, you can see that there is a flower here with two leaves. So all of that is done with the stitches in the thread. And the more you look, the more you see there's little leaf motifs here. And see that the bows are hearts on this quilt. The quilting served a practical purpose in that it held the batting in place. Early batting would shift a great deal. It wasn't so down. But obviously in this case, you are also using it for decoration. Here we're back seeing that quilt with the cross stitch. And here you can see an up close that this also has fancy quilting. And these quilts in the 20th century were printed with the quilting lines on them. So after you were done cross stitching it, then you put it together and you could quilt. And these lines have washed out when the quilt was washed. So all you have left is the stitches. Another way to fasten something together was to use ties. This quilt has fancy ties. There's a circle of black felt, a little red flower cut from red woven wool and tied with thick yarn or string. You can see the back of the knot here, and then there would be the front of the knot on top. And that holds the layers together. And there's that whole quilt. And one of the things that we talked about was warmth and making do or utility quilts. This is a make do quilt in that they've used all the different fabrics from the scrap bag and put them together, and they make a nice quilt that'll keep you warm. And these ties give it an extra pizzazz. This is another one from the Upper Saddle River Historical Society, and it's like the ultimate make-do quilt. The back is home-dyed sugar sacks. You can see here the outline of the sugar label, and here the information. They bleached them to get them out, so they're not as noticeable, but you can still see them. These are two that were on the back of a different quilt, and it was, here is Best Flower. And here, this was for some kind of washing detergent advertisement. So people were reusing these bags from mid, 1920s and up into the 50s and 60s in the rural areas. The make-do quilt also is make-do because the lining, the batting, is another worn-out quilt on the inside. So that quilt was recycled by putting a new cover on it. And the strings, the ties on this one, you see this is the back, those ties are probably made from the string from the sacks. So quilts are made for comfort. These are not quilts from the show, but these are quilts that the Brownstone makes to give away to children in group homes, to nursing homes, places where people appreciate that someone's thinking of them and making them something by hand. And quilts played a role in comfort during World War II. The Canadian Red Cross is making quilts to send to Europe. And here's a photo of Mennonite relief quilt being presented to a family in the Netherlands. These not only came from Canada, but from the United States as well. Crazy quilts and other fancies. Anna Maria Green Ackerman Christopher made this crazy quilt. It's crazy because these patches have no rhyme nor reason. They're just put down. And each crazy is made into a block. And that's generally how it's done. So there's some order. And she has added the initials, fancy initials of all of her family members. And you can see that embroidery is heavily used on these quilts for decoration along all the seam lines. And that is what the style called for. And so the woman is showing off her stitches and her ability to make something to improve the home. And these are all different styles of embroidered initials. This is for Elizabeth Young Ackerman and Jacob O. Ackerman. This was made in Bergen County. This is another quote from that time period, and I think you recognize that this is a log cabin quilt. Very different. It's made from silk and possibly velvets and has a whole different kind of look, but also in that barn raising pattern. And you see that the use of red in the center to draw, and these light blocks draws your eye right into the center of this. And there's that half block, the dark half and the light half. This quilt's from the Meadowlands. It's a brick pattern. If you turned it on its side, you'd see that those look like stacked bricks. It's made from silk and silky fabrics and or ribbons. This would have been made, somewhere between probably 1890 and 1920. So each piece of ribbon or fabric is sewed to the next one. So it's a pieced top, but all the seams are decorated with floss, and then it's just quilted right across each block. This is a fancy one for show that is supposedly made in Bergen County. We don't know by whom. Someone in the Ackerman family, but if you know about Bergen County, you know that that's not very specific. It's like saying the Smith family. This is all ribbons, and you did not make something like this for the bed. You used it to decorate your home. And you can see in this Victorian house picture that every surface has some kind of fabric covering. Tablecloth, piano cover perhaps, cupboard cover, everything is covered. So this would be used on a settee or on a table, across the bottom of your bed perhaps, to show off. And that's a close-up of some of the ribbons. So when we make quilts for show, it can be from fairly humble quilt to a very fancy quilt, like the chintz cut out with the Tree of Life design on it. Here the pastors come to visit in the humble cabin, and the families gathered around. They're talking with him. And I bet if you could stand here and turn around, you would see a bed in the corner, and on it she would have put her best quilt, and it could have looked like this. And here we have, in a grander house, a guest bed perhaps, and it is covered with a best quilt. This is another log cabin style and a pineapple pattern. This does not have it divided colors by halves of the blocks, so you end up with a different look to the block, but it's constructed in a similar way. And it is made from silks and velvets. See these velvet centers and the velvet in the corner. This is repeated so that this sort of ties the whole thing together. This was made by a cousin of Catherine Law Zabriskie Wessels, and we figured out the cousin was from New Paltz, New York, and Catherine lived here in Paramus, and their grandparents were from Hohokus. So the family had moved apart geographically, but they were still in touch. And this was a treasured piece that went to her daughter, and then to her niece, and then to her daughter-in-law, and then to be donated to the museum. And it really is a look at how important it is in families to treasure these objects and make sure they have good homes, either within the family or in the museums. So, like those album quilts of the 1850s and 60s, where everybody put their name on the block, we also have that in Crazy Quilts. This quilt has each person put their name or initials on the blocks, and they're all related to Maggie, Salyer, Ramsey. I should put her name on here so I don't forget it all. Anyway, they're all relatives. And Kate Demarest Ramsey, Mrs. GHR, and her daughters also have blocks. And she may have organized this, and it was given to a family member who had moved to Brooklyn, and as a recognition of friendship. And it descended through the family, which is how we were able to trace back to who the people are, whose initials are on here. It was made in 1891, 1892. Again, random patches, embroidery on the seams, real. So here we have friendship and show. This is in the collection of the Ramsey Historical Society, and another kind of friendship quilt. This is a very common friendship quilt block called chimney sweep block, and the pieces of fabric in the centers could be signed. Here, Mrs. John Y. Dater signed this block. And here she is as an older woman who probably, when she signed the block, and here she is as a young bride. And it was in her family that the quilt, one of the very first quilts I showed with the sunflower and the chintz, the palm chintz in the background, was in her family. This is another of those album quilts. It's a family quilt. There are names on every single one of these blocks. Some of them we know who they are, and some we don't. We got M.E.B. here, Francis M. Treadway here, and George E. Blauvelt here. So they're not necessarily the name of the person who made the block, but somebody you're recognizing. So Harriet A. Jones made a block with things that were common in her life: the scissors, a little reticule or purse, a pair of pants to iron and mend, and I think we've decided that this is the iron, like this, on the ironing board. Waiting for a better suggestion on that. But, and here, this is a little kind of purse with this little drop on it. And here the block for Cornelius has a harrow, a kind of farm implement that could be dragged to break up the earth, and arrows on his block. So in quilts that are in remembrance, there are whole quilts made to remember people. This is a quilt that's not in the show. It's owned by the Historical Society of Rockland County, but it has a block that's a memory block for this young man, in memory of Edmund H. Thompson, who died in 1851, aged 20 years. And so it's one of the many blocks on this quilt. Didn't have one in the show that represents this, so I wanted to put that there. But also, remembrance is something we currently do with quilts. This is the AIDS Memorial Quilt in 1996 when it was laid out on the mall in Washington, D.C. This is a section of that quilt. Individuals made the panels to honor people who had died from AIDS, and they could decorate them however they wanted. So these have all kinds of techniques and materials used to make these quilts. We also use quilts for honoring people. We have, there's several different kinds, but this shows the Quilts of Valor Foundation giving a quilt to John McCain to honor his service. And quilts are, this group makes quilts for veterans and presents them. And of course, our gifts of love. We have lots of covers for children. This quilt was made for a child and in the 1950s, and it's a little applique figure with buttonhole stitch holding it down and little embroidered flowers. And quilting has everything we've talked about. This was a little satiny quilt, and it was a whole layette set. There was a pillowcase and a sheet cover and a puff. And these were handmade in the Midwest. Women were organized and they sold them to high-end department stores. This is all hand quilting to make this design on a kind of rayon or silk. And this actually was still in the box. It was sold at Saks, Fifth Avenue, Saks Herald Square. And so these women made them and then they were sold to the department stores who sold them on. So this is from the 1920s. Another example of embroidered quilt. And you can see that how the little figures embroidered. Squares like this could be sold at the general store, department, dry goods store, and they were called penny squares because for a penny you could buy a square, and then when you had enough you could make them into your quilt. This quilt was entered in a quilt contest called Sears Century of Progress Quilt Contest. They offered a whole lot of money as a prize and encouraged people to enter. They weren't really thinking about 25-year-old quilts, but Minnie Banta entered her 1905 red work quilt in the Sears Century of Progress Quilt Contest in 1933 at the Sears store in Hackensack, and the tag is still on the front of the quilt. And we use quilts for storytelling. We didn't have one in the show. This one on the right belongs to the Bergen County Historical Society and has been displayed there, and has a wonderful surface underneath of all black silks and velvets, all different shades of black. And then on top, appliqued all these figures that one could tell any kind of story about. We have a train, we have croquet players, we have a carriage, we have an elephant, and on and on and on. And the Hmong story cloth. This is a tradition for coming out of immigrants from Cambodia to this country, and they're done in applique, and then this is pieced on the border. So, and storytelling has a good history in quilting, but they are very special quilts, so there are not a lot of them. So we've already seen some 20th century ones, but now we're going to see some more. This is a picture of ladies at their quilting frame in 1976 in Upper Saddle River at the library. They were quilting this quilt, and that quilt will be in our show. This is a quilt from the Meadowlands. It was made as a gift for Joseph and Catherine Fitzgerald Jankowski. And it was probably made by one of their mothers, and they both lived on Kingsland Avenue in Lyndhurst. This was just made from two fabrics. This is the pattern as it was published by Ruby McKim, and this is what you got. You had a picture of how it was going to be laid out, and you had a picture of the pieces, and you had to figure out how to put them together. And people did, and they made these wonderful quilts. These, by the 20th century, we're no longer passing things around woman to woman as we are, but we're also buying things through newspapers and periodicals. Here, all the way up into 1980, we're still selling mail order patterns and templates. And Mountain Mist batting came in a wrapper that had patterns. So this shows you all the patterns you could get. And then when you unwrapped yours, you got a pattern on the inside and hope that it was one you wanted. And if it wasn't, then you'd have to pay a quarter or something to order the one that you did want. Another kind of 20th century quilt, the yo-yo quilt. This was done in the 1930s by Mary Schweitzer Kube Lehman. And she cut out these circles to make this, and they're just sewed together at the edges. These are holes, so it's like a spread to lay over your bed. And she cut out the circles of fabric with the lid from a wooden cream cheese container. So she cut out the circle, and then she hemmed it and gathered it. And as you gather it in and tie it, then you end up with this little puff that you sew together to make the quilt. This is a spread made by Dikranoi Anna Kanian Nakashian. She was an immigrant from Armenia, from Turkey, and came to this country to marry Harry Nakashian, who had a carpet store in Fairlawn. Not probably when she got married, but this cover is interesting because it uses bark cloth, which was a famous decorating fabric of the 1950s. And it's very interesting the way the colors are balanced and it's laid out with this central focus here. There you can see some of the colors, the fabrics. And some of you will remember these in your house growing up or in your grandmother's house. They were very common decorating fabrics. And here we have an ad for fabric store in Ridgewood, and they are wanting to sell you all of those drapes and slipcovers, and they have the largest selection of highest quality bark cloth prints. In commemoration, in the time of the bicentennial, many quilts were made to celebrate our local towns. This one was made by the Pascack Historical Society, and all of those images are things from the Pascack Valley. This is a Collignon chair. They were made in Rivervale and used on cruise ships in the early 20th century. And the Hillsdale train station. And a fundraising quilt. This is a embroidered bicentennial time period quilt, hand quilted, that we are going to raffle to provide funds for our quilt show. Watch our website for details. And that's a close-up of, you can see the cross stitch and then the quilting that makes the pattern in the background. And with that, I think we're ready for some questions.
All right. Thank you so much for that description there. We've got a couple of questions that have come in. I'll leave mine second here. But we've got one from Paula asking, where were quilters getting their fabric and thread in the 1800s?
There were both dry goods stores and traveling peddlers who would sell both. I had doing some research in Ohio it was before 1820, so pretty early. And there was an inventory of a store that went out of business, and the owner died, so they had to make an inventory of the store. There were page after page after page of listing of the fabrics that were there. So there was a distribution network within the country, even out into places like Ohio.
Okay. And one question that I had here was, what in your opinion, should somebody do if they've got an antique quilt that's got some of those brown pieces of fabric in it disintegrating? Do you leave it as is, or do you try to find replacement fabric to insert in? And if so, if there is a repair option that's reasonable, are there places to find antique fabrics that might be searched for like age and colors to match?
Yes, 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 and no, and no, and no. It's very complicated, and really each quilt has to be looked at on its own merits and decide what you want from it. If you want to still use it, you definitely need to do something to protect those places, either patch over it with a new fabric or a new old fabric. There are people, if it is valuable enough, there are people who will do repairs. So I can give, I can probably give you some more information if you want to email me. You could send an email to Robin, and she'll forward it, or you can write down, it's Peggy W. Norris @gmail.com.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Have we got any other questions emerging here? If there are, you want to write them in the chat section. We've got a couple. Okay, here's one. First of all, Charlie Binder has indicated at one point during your talk that there are several memorial quilts at the 9/11 Museum made up of small photos of those who died. It was a very moving tribute. And he also asks, is it better to roll or fold a quilt for storage?
There are pros and cons to both. Rolling can put stress on the outside part of the rolled fabric, but you avoid fold lines. Folding often, especially with a quilt batting, the folds will eventually turn into creases. So you have to refold it in different ways. You can use acid-free tissue to put in the folds, and when you roll it, there is, I think, and maybe this is information I'll send to Robin and she can send out. There's information, I think, on the Smithsonian website about taking care of quilts, but I'll put something together because it's important to when you treasure something, it's important to find out how to take care of it, and because you want other people to be able to enjoy it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we've got a question from Jill McClay. She wants to ask about repair of quilts. She has a beautiful little satin eiderdown quilt from her Irish mother-in-law.
Oh.
Gorgeous embroidery, but the fabric is disintegrating and off-colored. Any ideas?
She said it was silk?
Yeah.
Silk is tough.
No, she said it's satin eiderdown.
Okay, so satin is not the fiber. I don't know what the fiber might be.
Hold on a second here. Let me find Jill in my list and we'll unmute you.
Yeah, I think it's,
okay.
I think it's like a silk linen combination. It's shiny, and it has to be, I don't know, early 1900s, I would think. It's shiny like a satin.
Is it finely woven?
Yeah. might be sort of a damask.
Okay.
Yeah.
The things that are bad for fabrics are heat, light, moisture. And where do we keep all those old things? In the attic or the basement? So it's a good idea if you can to find a place where it's not so hot. Not if something is fragile like that, you again want to fold it carefully and maybe use the tissue in the folds to keep it from compressing. I don't know of anybody doing quilt conservation work right around here, but you can also buy acid-free boxes to put special quilts in that then provide structure for something, but it's expensive and depends on your storage situation.
Mhm.
And fabric eventually wears out. So, you know, what do we, it's how do we make it last a little longer? How do we continue to enjoy it in our family? I mean, it's special when you have something from your Irish grandmother.
Thank you.
All right.
I'd love to see pictures of all these things.
Yeah.
We've also got a question here from Paula saying she has an old Gearman wool quilt about 4x6. Is it best to frame it with glass? It's from the 1820s.
What's a Gearman wool quilt?
Paula, can we unmute Paula? Let me see if I can do that from my end. I'm going to ask you to unmute Paula.
Something from the 1820s. It's, oh, a German quilt.
German, okay. An extra E is in there.
Something from the 1820s is pretty special, and it's going to be pretty fragile, and you might need a professional to decide what to do. It sounds like there's a lot of questions about taking care of quilts.
Well, what are the trade-offs between putting something under glass or not?
Okay, textiles like to breathe, so putting them under glass is not necessarily good. I think a creative framer could figure out how to do that. There's a quilt that's framed at the Pascack Reformed Church that is actually hanging on a rod inside the quilt, inside the frame. And if that also provides ventilation, you know, that might be appropriate, because dust is harmful, and obviously you can't wash. Yeah. So there are some things you can do to like remove dust, but everything is very tedious. I mean, you can use a regular vacuum cleaner and put it on low and put something over the nozzle, and then it doesn't touch the surface. You just put it down near the surface. And so sometimes it's worth having a professional consultation. Like I say, I don't have anyone to recommend, but
Okay. All right. And that looks like the end of questions, but Kathy Lanza has, I think, echoed and stated a comment here in the chat that I think most of us would fully agree with, and that's a thank you. This was an fascinating and very interesting program. And it's, to me, it was delightful to see all those different styles of the needlework, the amount of detail in them as well, with it, and to think that we can see why many women had to work at the same time on the same quilt, because to have one person do it would have taken a lifetime practically. But it was fascinating to see that styles and designs of it, and the detail work with it. So we got two
See, one of your guests today is Leo Nakashian. Are you related to Anna?
No, I'm not. No quilts in the house.
All right, we got, somebody has commented here that, let's see, Charlie Binder has said, MaryWKerr.com is a professional appraiser. Please check her website for conservation.
I
And
do know an appraiser in New Jersey if you want an appraisal. I don't, so those are two different fields, though somebody probably could be advised or do both of them.
okay. All right. Any other questions?
No, I thank you very much for having me. I would love when we can all get together to come and have each of you bring your treasures, and we'll look at them and share them together. I think we should do that program for post-COVID. Robin, put me
Yes.
down.
Okay.
I'll come and we'll have show and tell.
Okay. Sounds like a plan. And we thank you very much for contributing into this series. Just so everybody is aware, we do have another Zoom meeting scheduled now for April 20th. Bob Montgomery, who actually has been sitting in on this session, I think he's probably signed off by now. Oh no, he is still here. Good. Bob is going to be talking about rocks and minerals of the Meadowlands area and region. We have an exhibit in the museum itself that Bob helped put together. And since people aren't coming to us, we figured we would get Bob to take his exhibit that he curated for us back through Zoom to people who are interested. So whether you're interested or you know other people who would be, please get the word out that we will very shortly have it on our website for people to start signing up for that one as well. And the only other thing that I want to let people know about is that in April, we will be starting to take, for anybody in the Rutherford area, we'll be starting to take orders for our spring plant sale. Orders will have to be in by the 28th of April, and we will, which is a Wednesday, and we'll have our pickup system at the museum for it on Saturday, the 1st of May, which is a week before Mother's Day as well. So it's scheduled with that timing in mind. And there's a whole variety of both potted plants and bedding plants for gardens that we offer through this sale every year. So that's other things to look forward to. And with that, I'd like to thank everybody for coming to it, and I'm glad you had this interested. And we have a digital clapping here from Suzanne's iPad.
Peggy, that was a very nice talk. That was very good to hear. It's very informative.
Yeah. If anybody wants to unmute themselves, go ahead. And if you want to put any other little comment in here at this point.
A big thank you very much. And would you mind repeating your email again, please?
It's Peggy W. Norris, N as in Nancy, ORRIS @gmail.
Thank you. No periods in there?
Mm-mm.
Thank you. This is great.
Yeah, it's I'm glad to share it. And, you know, we didn't expect to have a COVID interruption in this whole process, but out of it, it came, you know, some silver linings, one of which is the idea to take it on the road. And, you know, I'm finding out that there are some people who don't know anything about quilts and find it interesting, and other people who know about quilts and want to learn more and share. So
Right.
you're asking me.
Okay. Thank you very much, Peggy. It's been a delight and greatly appreciate it. With that, I think I'm going, if anybody's got any other last questions, otherwise I'm going to end the meeting. And
Okay.
I'll see you all next time. Okay.
Bye.
Thanks, Peggy. Thanks.
Good.